Hi, everyone. My name is Robin Stafford, and I am the Regional Engagement Officer for the UVA Club of Charlottesville. We are happy to offer this wine tasting tonight with Eileen Sevier and Ben Jordan from Early Mountain Vineyard in Madison, just about 30 minutes north of Charlottesville. Feel free during the presentation to enter any questions you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen for Eileen and Ben, and they will be able to answer those. And now I'm going to turn this event over to Eileen and Ben and get ready to do the tasting with you all. So enjoy.
Thank you so much, Robin. And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing part of your Thursday evening with us. I feel like the weekend is just peeking around the corner, and it's a perfect time to taste some wine and share our story with all of you. As Robin said, we're just 30 minutes north of Charlottesville, and hopefully many of you have had a chance to come visit. But for those who haven't, hopefully we're able to share a little piece of our story, share some beautiful images, and entice you up to Madison to visit Early Mountain. At the end, I'll share a little bit about our opening plan because we are in the process of gently and very cautiously reopening our grounds and our tasting room. And I hope we're able to welcome some of you when you're all ready to join us. But until that time, it is so much fun to be able to do virtual events such as these, and was so pleased. Thank you, Robin, again, for your work putting it together, because often, we don't really have a chance to bring Ben and connect directly with all of you, a handful of times throughout the year. But over the course of the last 3 months, I think this is maybe our 15th or 16th virtual tasting. And so we get to tell our story, connect, and share wines with all of you. And I know it's brought an incredible amount of joy to me. And so wanted to introduce Ben, our winemaker, have a chance for him to share a few words. We'll run through just a brief overview of the Virginia wine scene, history and what's happening right now, a little bit about our story, and then get right into the wines because we have 7 to taste with you. So it's quite an ambitious task ahead of us. And so without further ado, Ben, do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Sure. I was born here in Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, and kind of meandered into the wine world by way of being a bike messenger and playwright. I got my MFA in playwriting, and moved to New York and got the wine bug there because I needed a job because no one was paying me for playwriting. I had lived in California previous to that. That's where I was a bike messenger, and moved out to California to work for an importer there. And then kind of at the same time as my family was planting some test vines in the Shenandoah Valley on our farm there, I realized that I was committed to the wine thing and needed to learn how to make wine. So learned the craft of winemaking in Sonoma County, in the Russian River Valley and in Dry Creek Valley, and then came back to Virginia in 2012. And that was always the idea. And so I started with Michael Schaps. I was his winemaker at Wineworks, and came over to Early Mountain in 2015 and have been working here as a winemaker, overseeing both the vineyards and production.
And you're right in the winery tonight, right?
I'm in the winery tonight. You can see the tanks back there behind me. Maybe hear our cooling system as well.
Well, wonderful. So thank you for that history. Now to give just a little bit of Early Mountain's history and our place in Virginia wine. Virginia, we like to say, is America's oldest wine region. Basically, settlers, from Jamestown times brought clippings with them from Europe and were putting them in the ground. And King James actually famously hated tobacco and really wanted this new world to be a wine-producing region. So he made a law requiring all male settlers in Jamestown to plant vines. It didn't work for a variety of reasons that I'll go into briefly, but he wasn't the only one encouraging winemaking. Thomas Jefferson, obviously our hometown founder, is the most famous original oenophile. So spent a lot of time in France, traveled throughout the top growing regions there, Champagne and Burgundy and Hermitage, brought wines back, and was determined that at Monticello he would plant a vineyard. He's a prodigious record keeper, and there's lots of records of him putting vines in the ground, but no records of him being able to make wine. So why wasn't that possible? Basically, there were two different kinds of grapevines. So the European grapevines that had developed independently are called Vitis vinifera, and they developed without resistance to soil louse, basically, that's called phylloxera, that when those vines were planted in the United States, or in pre-United States at that time, phylloxera would attack the root systems, and ended up actually bringing that back to Europe, almost devastated the vineyards in Europe at the time, until it was discovered that if you take American grapevines and graft them together with the European vines, that they're then resistant. So Jefferson didn't figure that out, the early settlers didn't figure that out, but thankfully that's what then has allowed an amazing wine industry here in the United States. Prior to that time, though, grapes from these Native American grapes exploded in popularity, and actually won renown at the Paris and Vienna World Fair, prior to this burgeoning industry really being wiped out by Prohibition. And so while Virginia has this very long history and many centuries of attempting grape growing, it wasn't until the very modern era, 1976, when Barboursville, not that far from Early Mountain, just about 15 miles southwest of us, planted successfully these Vitis vinifera vines. So grapes like Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay and Merlot, the names that you're familiar with, those famous European vines. And I call out three pioneers here. So Barboursville is a very important one, founded by the Zonin family, which is a famous Italian wine growing family. And they really did a lot of experimenting, put a wide variety of different grape varieties, saw what worked, saw what didn't, in some instances are on their third time of replanting to really find what's appropriate in our soil and in our climate. Two other important pioneers, one, Jim Law at Linden Vineyards, so about an hour and a half north of Early Mountain. He was so super focused on soils and finding what is the right site for these particular grape varieties. So Barboursville was finding, for our particular place, what are we going to put in the ground that's going to work? Jim was really seeking out different vineyard sites and also experimenting with different grape varieties. And then another pioneer that I call out, RDV, also searched throughout a wide variety of areas in Virginia till they found this perfect granite mountainside site where they could grow Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot, really emulating Bordeaux. So there's a lot of different pioneers, a lot of whom really surround us here in Charlottesville. But these are three that are really fun and important from us to learn from as well. So just showing you a little bit of a map of the growing regions in Virginia. On a whole, the kind of dividing into different regions, the way that Napa Valley does, for example, or Sonoma Valley, is quite young and immature in Virginia. So right now, they're broader geographies, and there's a lot of variability, but it's helping to kind of start hone in on some of this regionality. And you can see Early Mountain right here is this red star. So we are just outside the Monticello AVA, and as I said, just about 35 minutes north of Charlottesville. You head up on 29, and after Ruckersville, right before Madison, you head left towards the foothills of the Blue Ridge, and we are just in an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous spot. So a little bit about our history. So the property is about 350 acres. 35 of them are planted, and our history, as much goes back to colonial times when George Washington visited the Early family and really commented on the warm hospitality that was received there. And so that's really the inspiration for the hospitality that we want to bring to all of our guests and visitors at the winery. There's two beautiful historic barns on the property, one from the late 1800s that is still utilized today mostly for beautiful wedding pictures. But right there, it's one of the most notable things you see when you pull into the winery. From a vineyard standpoint, our earliest vines go back, our oldest vines go back to 99, when Quaker Run, which is a mountainside vineyard, it's about 10 miles from us as the crow flies. And Ben will speak a little bit more about the 2 different vineyard sites that we work with. So those vines were first planted in 99, which predates the Early Mountain property. Our property, though, was first developed for vineyard land in 2005 by Jess and Sharon Sweely. They built the tasting room, the winery that Ben is in, and also planted the blocks directly surrounding our tasting room. But now moving into our modern story as Early Mountain. In 2011, Jean Case and her husband, Steve, they're tech entrepreneurs. Steve was one of the co-founders of AOL. They'd lived in Virginia 35 years. They'd tasted a wide array of Virginia wines, and they were just struck by how delicious they were, how much the quality had improved since they first tasted. And like some entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs with a lot of vision and opportunity to invest, they wanted to really help tell that story. And the best way for them to do so was to purchase a winery and really invest in it with the goal of not just developing their own story and their own wines, but really using Early Mountain to tell a broader Virginia wine story. So from the very beginning, Early Mountain's mission has been to share Virginia wines on a whole with people in DC and throughout Virginia, but really with the broader world. So as the marketing director, I have a pretty high task because I'm constantly doing outreach far beyond our region to journalists in New York and in California, and really explaining why there's this incredible story happening in Virginia and they can be part of telling it. So 2012 is when we opened as Early Mountain. Welcomed a very famous wine consultant, Paul Hobbs. You might know of him for his California projects. He was also one of the first to develop wines in Argentina, and is really renowned for working in developing regions and helping to establish them as very high quality producers. And then another important pivot point in quality, 2015, as Ben said, that's when he joined the team. It's also when our vineyard team, our associate winemaker, Maya, moved into her role as associate winemaker, and Ben really, coalesced the quality winemaking team that we have. But it's also important because a second vineyard site, Quaker Run, which is our mountainside vineyard, first really joined our portfolio. And Ben will talk about the importance of mountain fruit. But growing in Virginia can have its challenges. Many of them are mitigated by these mountainside vineyards, which are increasingly being planted as people understand more and more about quality winemaking and wine growing in the region. In 2016, really wonderful accolade. As I said, we were founded based on this concept of warm hospitality. USA Today, in a reader's poll, Early Mountain was selected as the #1 tasting room in America. So really a nod to how much people enjoyed the hospitality provided there. And then in 2018, another important nod, Wine Enthusiast magazine, which is one of the premier wine collector, wine appreciator magazines, Wine Enthusiasts, nominated us American Winery of the Year. So one of only 5 wineries to be nominated, and the first time that any Mid-Atlantic winery joined that list. So really acknowledging the wine quality leaps that have happened. So I'll pass it over to Ben to tell you a bit more about the vineyards where most of the wines that we're tasting today were grown.
Sure, and I guess we should say, since we can't see you, go ahead and pour yourself a glass of something, probably the rosé, so that you're not waiting on us to walk you through it, and you can enjoy it while we're talking. So as Eileen said, we farm 2 distinctly different sites. So we have these rolling hills that are very kind of classical to Central Virginia, relatively heavier soils with clay that are around the winery and the tasting room. And then we have Quaker Run, which is our mountainside site. And I guess I should back it up a little bit and say that coming from California to Virginia, it was a transition, but it's really kind of an exciting place to be at this point in time for a younger winemaker, just because there's so much to do here. Even though there is some history, we're still very much an emerging region, and getting to be part of the foundational work in a region is something you only get to do once in a region's lifespan, and we're doing it right now. So that's really cool, really neat. But something else that is really nice about being a winemaker now in Virginia is that the wine consuming world is more open-minded than it's probably been ever. Just we've moved away from defining quality as only one thing into being open to many different styles, many different approaches, and that really fits with what Virginia has, which is various places to plant things and vintage variation, and just sometimes not just powerful wines, but more nuanced and kind of aromatically driven wines. So what that has enabled us to do, and on top of that, Rosé is a wonderful thing to have, and people like it. So it's a great thing to have here for Virginia. So the reason I say that is because what we realized as we started farming the blocks around Early Mountain is that although they may have been planted to be Bordeaux style reds, we found that these heavier clay soils didn't really want to push high ripeness into the wines. They wanted to be more, they wanted to be a lighter style. They wanted to be more fresh and acidic, kind of more white wine in style. And so as we worked with them, we started pushing all of the vines around the winery into either a lighter style red or a white wine or rosé. And so the first wine that we'll taste tonight is indicative of that sort of transition from trying to make red wine grapes into structured red wines, and understanding that didn't work, but the best use was for rosé at the same time as rosé was coming up, becoming popular, and it was it just coincided well. And then, as Eileen mentioned, we also farm Quaker Run, which we'll get to towards the end of the flight, which is where we have we have most of the red wines that we grow for our more structured wines, the ageable wines, the ones that have tannin and ripeness and are kind of more what we classically think of in terms of powerful red wines. So it's really nice as a winemaker to be able to work with these different types of sites, different soils, and make one type of wine over here and another one over here. To talk a little bit about why Quaker Run can do that, it's because it is a mountainside site. It is steep, it is south facing, and it's rocky. So all of that helps to take the rain that we have here. It's not like California where it stops raining in April and doesn't start again until October. We have it throughout the growing season. So in order to make a wine that gets ripe, you need the grapes to stay on the vine for a long time. And in order for that to happen, you need to not have them being overloaded with the water that's coming out of the sky. So you need a way to get rid of it. And on a steep slope, it either runs off. With rocky soils, it drains down. And when you're exposed on the south face and up on a mountain where there's wind, you have evaporation. So all of those lead to grapevines that we can hang for longer. So that's pretty much, I think, a quick overview of what we're farming and the kind of routes that we're taking with the wines. Let's see. So in terms of the winemaking, we're always experimental. So we never say that block has to be this. We're trying to figure out what the block wants to be. Obviously, what people want to drink is important as well. So we're trying to find the marriage of those two. So what that leads to is a whole lot of kind of boutique winemaking, a lot of small lots, sometimes as many as 60 different fermentation lots in the winery, which it can be a organizational challenge, but it's worth it because we get to figure out what each block wants to be. And on top of that, since we're farming a large percentage of what we make, we get to understand what our farming is doing and test that it is working for the wines that we're making. Rosé is a perfect example of the farming is very different than the farming that we would do for the last wine we'll have tonight. We are doing minimal intervention winemaking, which basically means we're not trying to add a lot of things to it. Most of the time, we're not even adding yeast. So we're letting whatever yeast are out there on the grapes in the winery already slowly start the fermentation. And that's mostly because you get more layers and development and complexity when you have a slow start to a fermentation, sometimes a slow end to the fermentation. So for the most part, we're just trying to let the grapes be wine and not mess with them too much. So with that, we can start to talk through this tasting, and we'll start with the 2019 Rosé. So Rosé is actually I say it's one of the hardest wines we make, in that there's so much thought that goes into it, from pruning in the winter through all the farming that happens in the spring and summer, and into harvest, and then we ferment. So because we're always trying to find this sweet spot of freshness that comes with what is effectively white winemaking with red grapes, but still with some layers and complexity, there's always work that we're doing in the vineyard to find freshness. And what that means is finding a way to not pick the grapes in the middle of the heat of August, which sometimes means carrying more grapes on the vine than you would for a red wine, and then picking them at the right time to preserve acidity, instead of just going for full ripeness. As grapes ripen, they get more sugar, which means higher alcohol, but they tend to lose their acidity. So there is a sweet spot with rosé and white wine making where you can lose your freshness, lose your verve and electricity that comes from acidity, and move into a heavier style. So the rosé is always walking that fine line. In general, we're using Merlot because Merlot has an ability in Virginia to be picked early, provide wonderful fruit flavors, good acidity, and nice color. And then we're blending in some of these other grapes that you see here, Cabernet Franc and Syrah, mostly for aromatics in terms of the wine.
And Ben, there's a question if it's unusual to take that approach, to have a blended rosé as opposed to a single varietal.
I wouldn't say that that's unusual. And so Provençal rosé tends to have more than one grape in it. What is unusual, I think, is our approach of doing many fermentations within the rosé separately, and sometimes in micro lots, just to be able to understand what we're getting from our farming and what we're getting from the different experiments that we're doing in the winery. So we can have, somewhere between 10 and 15 different fermentation lots just for rosé during a given harvest. And that's much harder than picking grapes, pressing grapes, putting grapes in one big tank, continuing to do so throughout harvest, and making your rosé in one tank. That is definitely the easier.
What most people do is that
Right.
single, yeah.
Maybe not just one, but not too many tanks. And every year, Maya and I are
like you guys.
what's that?
I said not 27 like you guys. No.
Right. Every year, Maya and I are like, why are we doing so many different rosé fermentations? And it's always because before the harvest, we decided we wanted to try this, we wanted to try that. But in the end, what it does is allow us the ability to blend. So there's always stuff that we kick out at the end and sell in bulk. And so it allows us to kind of perfect the blend, and definitely allows us to understand whether what we tried worked.
Yeah. And as far as Virginia kind of moving out into the world and finding fans, rosé is an important one because folks in DC love it. I mean, this is the wine that's poured at a lot of top restaurants, and how many people discover Early Mountain and sometimes even discover Virginia wine. I love this vintage because I've said this before, it really combines the super citrusy components of 2017 with a little bit of the riper, softer fruit of 18. And I think it just nails that, as you spoke to, the balance that you're trying to achieve between those two elements. Yeah. And everyone, join in, throw your comments in the comment bar or the question bar if you would like. And feel free to, as I said, ask away. I do want to keep us moving. Was there anything else you wanted to comment on with the rosé, Ben?
Well, one more thing I'll say about our rosé that's probably slightly unusual is that we're bottling slightly later and we're staying on the lees for the entire time. And what that means, the lees are basically, as fermentation happens, yeast multiply and convert sugar into alcohol. And as they get towards the end of fermentation, they can't handle the alcohol environment and they die. And they drop to the bottom of the tank or the barrel, and we call those lees. And the general approach is to get off of the lees as soon as possible to take the wine and clarify it by pulling it off of those lees. But we find that if we leave them on there, there's a kind of umami character that comes with them. There's a textural element, and it just brings more depth to the wine, as well as allowing us to work with lower levels of a preservative called sulfur dioxide that is in most winemaking, because the lees are protective, they're antioxidants in a way. And that, I just wanted to say that because that approach is consistent across our white wine making and even into some of our reds. So that sort of sometimes it just tastes like yeast, sometimes it tastes like bread. So that character can be found in different levels depending on how long our wines are aged on the lees. Rosé is generally bottled the earliest, which is usually late February, early March, so relatively early, but a little bit later than most rosés.
Yeah. So one other question, we make about 2,300 cases of rosé, at least in 2019, but it's definitely growing. So just putting that in perspective, we make about 10,000 cases of wine a year. So 2,300 is a significant portion of that, almost 25%. And then Angelica made note that Governor Northam serves this rosé in his garden before summer dinner parties, which is lovely. And I do have a little, in case you missed it, I wanted to share someone else who's a big fan of our rosé.
You always seem to have an amazing energy about you. You're always pushing forward. You always seem motivated.
Virginia, wine of Virginia, supporting my local winemakers. Early Mountain Rosé. I love this wine.
So that was a pretty cool thing to wake up to after Jose Andres, featured our wine at his showing on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. And to me, again, with this mission of really bringing Virginia wine out to the world and helping people understand what we know here in Charlottesville, that there's all of this amazing stuff going on. That was huge because we've been contacted by people all throughout the country wanting to try the wine, wanting to learn more about Virginia. So Jose is really not just a hero, but a really wonderful ambassador for us in Virginia wine. So moving to Pinot Gris, and should we do Pinot Gris and Chardonnay together or one at a time? What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think if you've got two glasses and you want to pour the two white wines into your glasses, then it's a good counterpoint to be able to do so. I'll do that as well.
And Kathy, I promise we'll get to your question.
But let's see. So Pinot Gris is something that's definitely evolved for us, just because if you bring Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio to the table, there's such this wide variety of style, from the light, just crisp Pinot Grigio style that a lot of people are familiar with, to these rich, off-dry, pretty alcoholic Alsatian wines. And I'd say we're not working at either end of that, just because of the way the fruit comes off the vineyard. For the most part, Pinot Gris acts a lot like Chardonnay here. So we'd experimented more with the Pinot Grigio style, knew we would never get to the Alsatian Pinot Gris style, and just realized that the best use for our Pinot Gris was something more Chardonnay. And there's actually some genetic relationship there. And so it kind of does make sense to make it in that way. But Pinot Gris is actually light purple. I mean, they call it gray in color. And so it looks almost like a red grape on the vine. But we are not doing any sort of skin maceration, so we're pressing directly, which means that the juice comes out clear and you have effectively a white wine. There's no copper or orange tinge to it. And we've moved mostly towards ambient fermentation, so no yeast inoculation in different styles of barrel. And in this one here, we're using both oak and a wood called acacia, which brings a more kind of lighter touch to the wine and definitely has a white flower kind of character that I think you can pick up here.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to look at it next to the Chardonnay that is next to it, the Chardonnay, we're doing something similar in that the fermentation is similar. It's in barrel. However, there is more new oak, so that is not a lot, but there is some. So you definitely pick up a little bit of the character of the wood there. And there is some malolactic fermentation, which brings a little bit more richness and breadth to the palate. And it's on the lees just a little bit longer, so you'll get a little bit more of the character of the dead yeast cells.
And so these are both 2018 vintage. And, you know, if you all pay attention to vintages in Virginia, or if you just experience them like we did in 2018, you might remember it was quite a rainy, incredibly rainy summer. And what I love about these two wines is that the style that you're making them in is very much to my taste, the way I love these grapes. And so it's so wonderful to see a tougher vintage, you know, what's possible from a quality standpoint, with a lot of dedication in the vineyard, a lot of hand sorting that we all helped with in the winery.
Yeah, in the whites and rosé, there was, I don't know if anyone remembers it, but I do because it was the time when the sun shone. There was a good week to 10 days where things dried out. It was towards the end of August into early September, and we actually had some sunshine. And that's when almost all of our white wines and rosé were picked. So it's still not as powerful as, say, 17 or 19 in terms of some of those wines, but there's definitely, it is more kind of normal for Virginia in terms of the wines, as opposed to the reds, which we'll get into later, where we basically made very little of the Eluvium, the last wine we'll taste tonight, and declassified most of that fruit into Foothills and Cabernet Franc in order to be able to elevate those wines. But there's still a sort of, there's a kind of blithe character to the reds that is more elegant and aromatically driven than usual.
And then staying with vintage, there's a question about 2020. So Kathy asked whether frost has had a big impact at Early Mountain.
So luckily for us, we've had pretty low impact from the frost. Our last big frost year was 2016. But in 2020, we got really lucky. The vines around the winery and around the tasting room are actually pretty low in elevation. So with frost events, for the most part, unless you get a true deep freeze, there are usually inversion layers, and there's the cold air moves from higher elevation down to lower elevation and pools in the lower elevations. And so in general, mountainside vineyards like Quaker Run do pretty well in the frost, and it's done well every year. But we always are challenged by frost at our lower elevation blocks around the winery, and so we actually have relatively large, if you've been out here, you've seen them, they look kind of like windmills, but they're large fans that move the air around. And in 2016, they didn't work very well for us, but in 2020, they saved most of our crop. The only exception was one block, which you see on your way in, that has Petit Manseng, which is pretty near and dear to my heart. So it was tough to lose. We probably lost a good 60-70% of that block to frost. If you see it now, it's green and growing. There's just not going to be much fruit on the vines this year.
Yeah, and it's a great question though, because many vineyards, unfortunately, were pretty impacted this year. You know, I've heard some of our good friends, be it at Stinson or King or a variety of different sites around Monticello, did get quite impacted, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was a strange year because it almost seemed to be a latitude situation where if you were below a certain latitude. So it's actually further south, people got hurt more than further north. Everywhere that you were in a low place, you had more danger. So there were certainly people up north that got frosted in their lower areas, but it seemed to be more widespread down here, even at higher elevations, or down south of us, I'm sorry.
And one comment, Cunningham Creek too. Are they out near the coast though, I thought? Or am I mixing them up with?
I think there's further east.
They're further east, okay. And then a question about how long would you keep these wines? So these are both, sorry, I don't have the bottles with me. Light and fresh, generally, I'd say what, 3 years? 3 to 4 years?
But both of these are meant to be enjoyed now. And we make another Chardonnay from the Quaker Run Vineyard, from some of our oldest Chardonnay vines that we purposely make for longer aging. But we want you to be able to enjoy this now. That said, I mean, it's got some concentration and some acidity, so it's not gonna, you're not gonna lose it. It's, if you like wine to have more a mature flavor, then you should give it a couple years.
And so Bob asked a question for me, I feel like. Do you find differences in who prefers Pinot Gris versus our Chardonnay, which is lightly oaked? There's a light oak statement on it. And I guess I'll answer the Chardonnay question first. So Chardonnay, most popular grape variety in America, most planted grape variety in Virginia, but there is certainly a bit of a backlash, or a bit of a, I'd say, a dichotomy between people who love that buttery, rich, oaky, toasty, intense, you know, almost caricature Chardonnay style, and those who have had way too much of that, and they say, no, thank you, I am done with Chardonnay. And what I will say about our Chardonnay is often I will pour it for people who say, oh, no, thank you, I don't drink Chardonnay. They will taste it and they'll say, oh, wow, I usually don't like Chardonnay. I really enjoy this wine. So I feel like we do fit that non-Chardonnay enjoyers style, in the sense that it's super balanced. And I think especially with 18, the bright, super citrusy notes of it, I feel like veer it almost even into people who maybe would normally like a French Sauvignon Blanc, or, you know, more of that Chablis style, certainly. Pinot Gris, I think it's just a very friendly wine. It's a wine that no one is going to necessarily dislike, because there's nothing super pronounced about any of the character. You know, it's just fresh and, you know, has this wonderful texture to it, and has those beautiful floral and fruit aromatics that you're not going to get really aggressive opinions in one direction or another. To me, it's just, you know, that friend that you can bring along and gets along with everybody, and super friendly with summer fare on the table too. I don't know if you'd add any other thoughts to that, but that's usually what I find with these wines. Yeah. So any other questions before we move into the red? We'll keep going.
And just something I'll say about, so when you're not adding yeast to your wines, it's actually much easier to do that with red wine making, just because red wine making, you're throwing all the grapes into the tank, they stay there. And when you do that, you have this mass of, it's a mass of grapes that actually holds the heat in, and the yeast do much better when it's warm, and the fermentation is quick and it finishes. But when you're doing that with white wines, you don't have those grapes there with them. You're pressing right away and making juice. And so sometimes, especially when you get into the riper scenarios that we have with Quaker Run Chardonnay or Petit Manseng, you can have these fermentations that will, instead of a week or two, they can stretch out to 2 months, they can stretch out to 4 months, they can stretch out to a year. And when you're doing, that is a little bit edgier, because when you're working like that and you're allowing microbes to just be active for such a long time, it is, you have a higher chance of spoilage. So it is a riskier way of winemaking, but in the end, when you have longer fermentations, especially in whites, you have more development of aromatics, you have a lot of times more texture, and the end result is almost always more complex. So we do like to work that way. It just can be a little stressful sometimes.
There's a question. The Chardonnay from our old vines is called Quaker Run. So it's a vineyard designate. Only about 100 cases are made a year. And 2017 is our current release. So it's been such an extended time aging, well, extended time fermenting, then extended time aging. We give it some additional bottle age before releasing. And it's a pretty special Chardonnay. So moving to red wine land, we'll start with soif. And so soif is a French word that means thirst. And I hope you guys saw in the note I put in your pack that we recommend chilling it. So this is in that style of wine that is kind of gaining popularity of chillable reds. So juicy, fruit-led, you know, very, very friendly and inviting, but also very layered and fun wines. So a blend of 3 different grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc. And we're going to compare this to Foothills, which is another blended wine, but made in a little bit of a different style and with a little bit more broad shoulders, a little bit more tannic structure to it. Although from the 18 vintage, so in a lighter version of that.
Yeah, so Soif is, we started in 2017. It was kind of a happy accident in that we had more fruit than we thought we had. And so we threw some Merlot and some Cabernet Franc in a tank together and decided to do an experiment with something called partial carbonic maceration. And not to get too deep in the weeds on that, but it is a way of producing very fruit-driven wines that are relatively low in tannin. And so they lend well to juicy, chillable reds. And it ended up being delicious. And so we decided to bottle some for our member club, and they loved it. And so we made it again in 18, and we've made it again in 19. And as Eileen mentioned, this is a style that is especially as we moved away from red wine only needing to be highly tannic and highly ageable and 14.5% alcohol, and there being a range of tastes and styles. This has been something that's really working well for us, and especially because the weather we have now, you know, you can drink white wine and rosé all summer, but sometimes the food you're eating, sometimes the mood you're in, you actually just want some red wine, and being able to chill it is a big deal. And part of what makes a red wine chillable is not having too much tannin, because when you cool a wine down too much, it can accentuate the tannin and make it unpleasant if it's a big ageable red, but something like Soif is perfect for that. So, you know, it's kind of amazing to believe that there was a time when people didn't drink rosé, and they had to deal with
Not that long ago.
Virginia summertime, and it was an even shorter amount of time that we realized that we could be drinking red wine in the summer as well. So this is something we'll continue to be able to do. And the other thing it does is allow us to use these grapes around the winery again. The ones we use for rosé can be repurposed for something like Soif as well, because we can pick it earlier. We're not worried about extracting tannin. And so you're actually looking for some of the flavors that come from earlier picked fruit, which are more herbal and like lighter red fruits. And so it's made our winemaking more flexible and allowed us to bring the quality up as well. And I imagine at some point we'll having to be making decisions between the grapes here, between Rosé and Soif, as they both increase in popularity and production.
Yeah. And so for anyone who's tasting along, who's maybe saying, oh, tannin, I've heard that word so many times. What does that mean? It's an antioxidant compound that comes from the skins and seeds of grapes. And it's that drying sensation that you get after tasting a really big, bold red wine. And I think an analogy that's helpful for people, I mean, we'll point it out again when we get to the Eluvium, but there's also tannin in black tea leaves. So if you've ever steeped black tea and left it in for a little bit too long, and that really puckery, intense sensation that you get when you taste it, that's tannin. So you can taste Soif has very little, and when you chill a wine, it accentuates the tannin, which is why for the most part you're not going to want to chill your red wines because it might throw that tannin character out of whack. But for Soif, with its very low level, the chill actually then makes that tannin exactly at the level it's meant to be at, and really help balance the kind of the total package of the wine.
Elizabeth has a question: how does this differ from a Meritage? And that's actually a really good question because, you know, this is 33% or 34% Cabernet Sauvignon. And so when people think of Cabernet Sauvignon, they think of a certain thing. But what we're doing is we're not trying to make Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot or Cabernet Franc. We're making this Soif wine, which is taking, it's more about the way you treat the grapes than it is about the grapes themselves. And so instead of making these grapes that are usually tannic and ageable, which is what a Meritage is, it's effectively a Bordeaux style wine made from the different Bordeaux grapes that is meant to be aged. And instead we're making something light, fruity, and fresh.
Right.
So even though it could be, you could have a Meritage with the exact same blend, this is, the wine is the polar opposite.
Right. So if I do my marketing right, you know, 5 or 10 years from now, they'll say, oh, it's not a Meritage, it's a Soif.
There you go.
And Foothills, so another blended wine, also really meant for every day, but kind of more for season, less about really chilling down and having a red in the summer.
Yeah, and I think speaking of Meritage, is probably kind of the bridge between Soif and a Meritage, although especially in 18 veering a little bit closer to Soif in terms of just being lighter on its feet and chillable if you need to. Foothills, so you guys are all drinking these out of effectively screw cap bottles, but our Rosé, a white wine we have called Five Forks, which is a dry white blend of Sauvignon Blanc and Petit Manseng, and Foothills are all siblings, and they're all bottled in screw cap as a kind of signal that, hey, don't take us too seriously. Yes, we're going to bring you some complexity, but you can open us tonight, any night you want, and then we're going to be fresh and delicious, and you can drink us with food or without. So Foothills is the red wine sibling in that group. It's always been based in either Cabernet Franc or Merlot, depending on what the vintage gives us. Generally Merlot, and it's what we're doing. We're working a little bit more in that Meritage Bordeaux style in terms of blending for those sorts of flavors and a little bit of tannin, but the winemaking and the growing is really more towards a fresher, more fruit-driven style. So we want to bring kind of a more classical style, what people think of when they think of red wine, as opposed to Soif, but without the need to age it, the ability to drink it now. And it's, while Rosé is probably, I say, the most technical wine or the most challenging wine to make, this is the one that's most challenging to blend because we are working with so many different blending components. And one thing that kind of popped into our minds and became something we do every year in 2016 was the use of Petit Manseng, just a small amount, somewhere between I don't think we've ever gone higher than 5%. And Petit Manseng is a white grape that has some relatively tropical flavors and some richness to it. But what it does is it takes some of the more herbal components that are in these red grapes and wraps them up into this kind of tropical blanket, and does something not unlike pineapple and basil, the way those flavors marry, and just brings a certain juiciness to it as well. So we've done that in every vintage since 2016. We're doing it again in 2019, and so it's just a little kind of extra non-red wine making thing that we do to give it more character.
And there's actually a couple questions about Tannat. So one is the Tannat in Foothills from Adventure Farm?
The Tannat in Foothills, is that in Adventure Farm, from Adventure Farm? What is the percentage again?
It's low, it's 2%.
You know what, I think it is. Yes, so we we buy a little bit of fruit from them. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of Tannat to sell, so we never get very much. It's usually like a barrel or two. And then we actually, we make their wine here for them. They're a small, we help them out basically. I've known them for a long time. And the kind of lucky part of that is that if they have a little bit of Tannat left over, we get to buy it. So I'd have to check my records to be sure. But we basically have Tannat, a little bit we get from them, and then we have some at Quaker Run as well. The reason I'm thinking it is from there is because in 2018, a bear ate almost all of our Tannat. We had some pretty crazy bear problems in 2018. When you have those rainier vintages, a lot of times whatever food that is in the forest can decompose because of too much moisture, and the animals get hungry. And we put nets over our fruit, which keep the deer and the birds away, but bears are much stronger than our nets. And I don't know why, but it decided it'd like to eat unripe Tannat, which to me tastes terrible. It's really high in acid, has a lot of tannin, and in general was not able to keep it down either. So it was a big waste of Tannat, but almost all of it went to the bear in 2018.
And another question about Tannat, can you tell us about it? We find it mainly in Virginia, and it's a grape that originates in France, is found in Uruguay, but it's definitely finding a bit of a foothold here, and we're planning more of it because it's such an important blending grape, as well as a grape that hopefully we're able to do as a single varietal more and more.
Yeah, and I think actually that brings up an important part of about what Virginia is and what Virginia will be. So these grapes, Tannat is one, Cabernet Franc to a certain extent, but definitely Tannat, Petit Verdot, and Petit Manseng are all grapes that are really powerful, almost sometimes have too much structure, too much tannin, or too much acid. But in Virginia, where we have more heat and we have rain, they can be tempered by those climactic events. And I like to say that Tannat and Petit Manseng in particular are storm grapes. They, in the drier vintages, they can be more challenging because they want to be tempered a little bit by a thunderstorm. They want they want to drink some water before you pick them, something, or else they can be too intense. So, but that said, you put either one of them in the right place and they really do well here in Virginia. And as Eileen mentioned, we have plans. We are already using it in a lot of our blending, but we also have some plans to do single or varietally bottled Tannat. We make a little bit from Quaker Run that pretty much sells out to our members. But this year we actually planted 2 more acres of it, and we have another acre we're going to plant next year. So once those vines are mature, we'll have a lot of Tannat to deal with. Yeah, I'd say the only problem with Tannat is there's not enough of it here in Virginia, and there's more people that want to use it, so it's almost impossible to get if you don't have it planted.
Yeah. And I would say the common thread through the Rosé, the 2 reds we've tasted so far, is the role of blending. And that's very much your artistry, the work you and Maya do together. But moving to the Cabernet Franc, this is a case where, although you did blend a little bit in this one, but for the most part, it's going to be a single varietal, and Cabernet Franc can really help tell the story of site for us here in Virginia.
Right. Yeah. So Cabernet Franc, I think we've decided that of the red grapes that we grow, it is the one that most shows place. So, in the wine world, I think Pinot Noir is given that position a lot of times in Burgundy and California and Oregon and other places where people really dial into, like, this is from this one block, we bottled that separately. This is from another block, we bottled it separately. This is from this region, this is a Russian River Pinot, this is an Anderson Valley Pinot, this is from this village in Burgundy or that village in Burgundy. But Cabernet Franc is where we find the ability to do that. So we work with Cabernet Franc from the Early Mountain sites. We work with it from Quaker Run, and then from 2 different vineyards in the Shenandoah Valley. And each make distinct wines. And because of that, instead of making just one Virginia Cabernet Franc, we have decided to make 4, or in the case of 2019, 5 Cabernet Francs. So in 2019, we will have 3 vineyard-specific Cabernet Francs, so 1 from Quaker Run, 1 from a Shenandoah Valley vineyard, and 1 from a Northern Virginia vineyard, and then 2 what we call regional Cabernet Francs, which are meant to showcase the smaller region that they grow in. So we have 1 that's from 2 different vineyards in the Shenandoah Valley, and then 1 that is from Madison County, so from both of our vineyards. And that's where the blending is on this wine, is from, we're blending Quaker Run with Early Mountain fruit. And in 2018, just because of the character of the vintage, we decided to just make 2 Cabernet Francs. So we made the Shenandoah Valley and the Madison County. And in general, Quaker Run's bringing a little bit more darker fruit, a little bit more tannin, and the vines around here are a little bit more in that Soif style. They're more fruit-driven, fresh, and both are bringing Franc aromatics. And I think Cabernet Franc, in terms of the East Coast, in terms of the Mid-Atlantic, is a grape that is grown as far north as Canada and as far south, I think, as North Carolina. And every single state and the subregions within the state, it makes a different wine. So it is kind of it's not an East Coast grape, it's grown everywhere, but it is a grape that can do well up and down the East Coast and kind of give us all these different wines. So the East Coast has embraced it. And I think
the Coast is approaching it way more as a purely varietal bottling versus, of course, certainly Bordeaux or California as well, where it's usually a piece of the blend.
Right. Yeah, we've embraced it much more as varietal bottling than anywhere except Loire Valley in France, probably.
Yeah. So our style, though, generally, and here again we have 2018, but it will range from lighter aromatic freshness to more kind of intense, full-bodied. Our Shenandoah Springs Cabernet Franc from 2017 was pretty full throttle. And that's why it's so fun to see them on their own, to see the reflection of sight. And just to give a little plug again for our wine club, oftentimes these different individual bottlings never make it quite out into the world or even to our website because they are purchased by the club or offered to them first. So a couple just quick questions. Elizabeth is going back to Tannat. She says she didn't hear of it in California, and there's not much. I think the only Tannat I've had that's varietal from California is from Tablas Creek. I don't know if there's others you know of. Caldwell
has one.
That's right. What varietal is it closest to? It's so Tannat.
Its own thing. I mean, it's the TANN is like the TANN in tannin because it brings all the tannin. But it can be a really powerful, high tannic variety in France. So Michael Schaps, who I worked with when I got here, always loved this one producer in Madison in France. And basically the approach to drinking those wines was to buy them and then to not touch them for 10 years because the tannins made the wine so closed and hard that it just was unpleasant. But then 10 years down the road, you have a beautiful wine. And that tests everyone's patience. But that's where I think, like Petit Man's saying, the grape almost does better here in that it doesn't require you, it doesn't come with as much intensity because of our climate. We come with a little bit lower acidity, which helps bring the tannin down. And so we can, there's still some of our, most robust wines that we make in the state, but we don't have to wait 10 years to drink them.
And I mean, my opinion on Tannat is that it is so critical as a blending component. I have seldom had a Tannat in Virginia, Uruguay, anywhere that I think captures what I'm looking for in a wine, which is some elegance. Maybe I don't have the patience to wait long enough. But my theory is that Tannat in Virginia is super interesting because it brings that intense power, and it's very hard to grow Cabernet Sauvignon here, which can play that role in other regions. And that might be one reason that it's pretty fascinating for consumers, because it's like, oh yes, that power. I want that for someone who's seeking that, pair it with a big steak on the grill.
And for the winter, yeah, Cardi red wine, it's the one that does it.
Yeah. So moving to Eluvium, and just a quick call out on the label that Elizabeth was commenting on. So our labels are very much a representative of what Ben has shared with regards to our winemaking philosophy, what the vision of Gene Case is for the winery. It's not trying to be California. It's not trying to be France. We're not trying to emulate a different region versus look to them for inspiration, but really discover what is Virginia meant to be. Along those lines, we ripped out Cabernet Sauvignon and planted Petit Manseng in the spring, because that is where we really see the reflection of what should grow in our site. And so the elevation lines on the label really bring that to the forefront, because it's the elevation surrounding our winery, with the arrow really representing, we're not, we're trying to represent a place and capture that. So thank you for commenting on it. But moving to Eluvium.
So moving to Eluvium. So speaking of more ageable, more powerful red wines, Eluvium definitely is where we're moving into that level of winemaking. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a wine that is based in Quaker Run. So along with those old vine Chardonnay vines we talked about earlier, some of which actually go into that Chardonnay, not the oldest vines, but some other vines from Quaker Run go into the Chardonnay we tasted earlier. But we have the other oldest vines that we have are Merlot vines. And so Eluvium could technically, in every vintage except 2016, be labeled as Merlot. But because we were blending more towards a Bordeaux style, we thought it made more sense to label it as a name, as Eluvium, because we weren't going for Merlot, we were going for this ageable Bordeaux style oak aged wine. So these vines have the ability to hang through weather events because of the site, but also because of their age. So the roots are much deeper into the soil than many of the younger vines in Virginia. So they're less affected by some of the rain events where, the top foot of soil is soaked. And also they're just less vigorous because of their old age. And so because of that, they mature slower over time. And maybe during some of those late August, early September thunderstorms, they're still at a much earlier stage of maturity, much less affected by the weather. But really what it comes down to is the site and the fact that we're on this rocky south-facing slope that can ripen grapes to a certain place. So we're working with the Merlot there. Something I've always loved about the Merlot at Quaker Run is its ability to have concentration and structure and ageability while also having aromatics, and just always having a certain sort of perfume to it that is that it gives us every year. And then in order to give it a little bit more structure and foundation, we bring Petit Verdot into the equation, which, like Tanat, can be a big, hearty, tannic red wine, but is a wonderful blender, especially to Merlot. The flavors marry well, and it just brings the right amount of tannin and actually acidity to make the wine more ageable, allow it to have more time in barrel, and then more time in bottle. And so in general, it ages for about 18 to 20 months, depending on the vintage, in barrel, and then another year in bottle before we release it. And at that point in time, it's just starting to show itself. And I think right now, you've gotten a bit of a decant from Eileen moving it into these bottles, so that's helped it. But we were just tasting it the other day and realizing that it's just starting to come into itself.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that I think everyone's getting the benefit of it being opened yesterday, put in the mini bottles, transported, and now tasted in glass, because it's really opening up aromatically. to Angelica's question of how long can we keep Eluvium, I mean, easily 5-10 years if you're storing it properly, you know, if not beyond. It depends on how you like to drink your wines. But there's a lot of ageability here for sure.
Yeah, it's built for aging. If it's in this bottle, don't age it. But
yes.
But yeah, in general, it's a wine that is meant to act like the ageable wines of the world, and to develop in terms of, you know, to soften and to develop aromatically as it ages, and just become more complex. So when we talk about wines like this, I always like to say, so I have a wine buying problem. As a winemaker, I need to expose myself to the wines of the world, and I do a very good job at that, too well. And so, but with wines like this, I always like to see how the wine develops, and you can't do that with one bottle. So when I'm looking at wines like this, I buy 3 bottles so I can drink one when I get it, and then kind of make mental notes about when to try the next one when I think is right. Do that one, make sure that's, you know, not too far down the road, and then decide whether I made a good decision there, and figure out the 3rd bottle from there. And then you just get to see the evolution of the way wine ages. And it's, you know, it's not something we do as much these days, because there's wines like Soif out there that are meant to be drunk the day you buy them. But it is a neat thing to do, is to see how a wine that can be, you know, delicious at this age becomes something completely different 5-10 years down the road.
Yeah. And you're getting lots of kudos on the Eluvium.
Cool.
To Elizabeth's question, do we sell magnums? In very small quantities. I usually release them around the holidays. And so I will say a couple of quick shout outs with regards to keeping in touch with us. Of course, we'd love to see you at the winery if you are interested in heading out. We are opening our doors for the first time June 19th. So we're doing a club exclusive event this weekend. And then June 19th for the weekends, Friday through Sunday, we're going to be opening with very limited numbers. So taking reservations, you can link out from our website. But also there's so many different ways that we've been engaging. So we are doing virtual tastings every week. We're hosting one tomorrow with Drinkwell at Walsh Family Vineyards Facebook page. We're doing another on Saturday, inviting 2 other Virginia winemakers, Joy Ting and Nate Walsh, to join us Saturday night on the Early Mountain Facebook page. And we're going to really keep up these virtual tastings. So keep your eyes open to our Facebook page and our website if you're interested in joining in. And we do a lot of small batch production, small releases, things like magnums that go out first to our club and to our mailing list. So if you're interested in learning more, getting your hands on some of those special gems, that's the best way to do so. And I want to give a minute or 2 for any other questions, although also be sensitive to the fact that folks might have dinner ready and want to head on to their evening. Oh, sorry, I did mean to call out this question because it made me laugh. Ashley's question of percentages. So Ben, when it gets down to blending with such small percentages, and you're now putting like 0.5 on some of the tech sheets, what is the process of deciding on that percent?
That is honesty. We have a winemaking software that we use that keeps a very good track of things, and the federal government cares that you are labeling your wine correctly, so we're honest about it. So the reason it ends, every once in a while we are blending down to 1 or 2%, but sometimes it has to do with the fact that if a barrel is not full, a barrel will go bad. So, but you don't just pick grapes to full barrels. So we'll be making wine during harvest, we'll ferment, and we'll start to fill our barrels and realize that we have 3/4 of a barrel. And we don't have any more of that wine, and sometimes we don't have any more of that grape variety to top it. So we need to put 25% of that barrel in another grape variety, and try to do that intelligently with, you know, stuff that we know we may be using to blend or that is of similar quality. So every once in a while we'll end up with 1% of something like Cabernet Sauvignon because of that. Or it may just be because we blended in 1% of Cabernet Sauvignon or 2% Petit Manseng. So it kind of goes both ways, but it's, since we keep good track of what we're doing, we label what we're doing.
Yeah. There's been a couple of different questions about how we feature other Virginia wines. So that really goes back to the core mission of the winery, which is to tell a broader story of what we're excited about in Virginia wine. So from the very beginning, we have what's called our Best of Virginia program. And essentially we're featuring other wineries' wines from throughout the state. And it's things maybe I've tasted or Ben's tasted or our GM Davis tasted that we're excited to showcase and share with others. We, not currently while we're first opening, but I'm sure we will again soon. We have a flight program. That's my favorite part of our offerings at the winery, where we're building horizontal or thematic flights where you can compare 4 wines side by side. So that might be 4 different wineries, Virginia Rosés, or it might be 4 age-worthy wines as we're heading into the winter season. Or we might showcase, within kind of a light, juicy reds that will pair them together. So showcasing other wineries' wines allows us to have much more interesting comparisons. It's also the approach I've taken with our virtual tasting. So our Taste of Virginia virtual tasting series, we've brought together now dozens of different Virginia winemakers and showcased a wide array of wines. And really it's because that's how people want to drink and taste. And we are selfish and we like drinking other people's wines, sometimes more than we want to just sit down and revisit our own. So it also gives people a reason to come and, if you want to recommend one Virginia winery where you can taste across a wider variety, we're happy to offer that to people. So there's lots of reasons to do it, and it's one of the more fun parts of our program, for sure. Personal favorite and why, Ben? Which wine that we tasted today is your standout? You weren't really tasting. I was doing that job for both of us.
Yeah, it's always hard. So I'll give you 3 answers because that's what I always do. The Cabernet Franc was probably one of my personal favorites because of the ability to play with these different sites and just keep on learning about what Virginia has to offer site-wise. On the table, I mean, Eluvium, just because it shows us what Quaker Run can do. And then a wine that's not on the table is Petit Manseng, because I think that grape just has so much potential here in Virginia. It is a grape that has no benchmark, so we get to write the story of the grape. And it's just the wine that my favorite vintage is the one that's coming up, because we get to hopefully improve upon it.
Awesome. My favorites, I mean, I've been loving Soif, mostly just because I've been warm and, stuck with my kids all day. And so it's been nice to really enjoy a glass of wine at the end of the day. I mean, I study wine, I work in wine, and it's very rare that I really treat wine as that kind of treat aspect. And Soif just does that really nicely. This is my favorite vintage of Rosé that we've done. I love that wine. And I'm loving how Eluvium shows after being in a tiny bottle for a day. So let's see. So I'm trying to make sure we've answered everything. And please don't feel you all need to stay on. There's a question about sharing the presentation and the recording. I know the recording will go out. I'm happy to share the presentation with Robin so she can share it out as well. And if there's any other questions, my email's right there. Happy to answer them and continue sharing our story with you guys.
Thank you so much, Eileen and Ben. This was a terrific program.
Yeah, no, thank you for having us. It was great.
Thank you for having us.
Have a good night, everyone. And yes, we will send a copy of the recording to all the registrants, and it will also be available on the UVA Club's page on our website. Thank you.
Awesome. Good night, everyone. Enjoy.